Okay, now we're going to just quickly go over the sort of historical perspective on psychology and where the psychology of the science of psychology came from and its founding principles and founding fathers, if you will, of psychology. And that's what we're going to do in this particular week. When we look historically, Wilhelm Wundt, founder of psychology, Edward Titchener, structuralism, Charles Darwin and Francis Galt, functionalism, Max Wertheimer, Gestalt, John Watson, behaviourism, B.F. Skinner, behaviourism, Sigmund Freud, psychoanalysis, Abraham Maslow, humanistic, cognitive psychology, evolutionary psychology. Then we can look also at sociocultural psychology and neuroscience. We're going to review all of these as they give a historical perspective of where psychology came from. Now we're going to begin at what we would consider to be the father of psychology, but that's kind of an odd way to put it. But in 1879, a German philosopher and physician, Wilhelm Wundt, performed an experiment to measure the lag time between the instant a person heard a sound and the instant they pushed the button, indicating that they heard the sound. Now in Wundt's experiment, it was so significant because it was about the workings of the brain. It was the first attempt to study a mental process in a quantitative, and if you remember quantitative, that's about the numbers, you can count it, in a quantitative manner. Now, if we continue on with some of the early approaches in psychology, one of Wundt's students, E.B. Titchener, wanted to search for the basic elements or the basic structures of mental thought. And the approach was to explain thoughts through looking at structures, and it became known as structuralism. Now, what he would do would be asking people to describe feelings on one of three different dimensions. Either it would be pleasure and displeasure, tension versus relaxation, or excitement versus depression, and that would be on a scale. Now, one of the most common ways to study these structures was through a process of introspection. And this is where the subject was asked to report on their thoughts and feelings about what was going on around them. Titchener would ask, what they were thinking when they heard a repetitive, sharp clicking sound, as an example, and you would get an introspection view. Now, functionalism, rather than focusing on the structures of the mind, functionalists focused on the ways the mind and behavior adapts to change in the environment. Now, this was influenced heavily by Darwin's book on the origins of species by a means of natural selection. Now, Francis Galt, he initiated a study that of individual differences and what role genetics or inheritance made in mental abilities. And this was followed by William James, who saw the process of mental abilities as fluid, not rigid and structured. He spoke of the stream of consciousness. And so we see the development of psychology and growing into something, one, a little bit more scientific, but also struggling to put, some understanding to mental processes that otherwise couldn't be seen. Now, the Gestalt, this was a slightly different view. Gestalt psychology was founded by Max Wertheimer in the early 1900s, and where Wertheimer criticized the structuralism and an introspection approach as being too unscientific. The Gestalt psychology argued that our brains take stimuli and arranges them into meaningful wholes, or gestalts, which are greater than the sum of their parts. Gestalt psychology can be demonstrated in really neat sort of ways, as these pictures here represent. You might see the vase, or you might see two people facing each other. You might see a young woman, or you might see an older woman. You might see a duck, or you might see a rabbit. So this was the principle of Gestalt. Now, Gestalt psychology suggested, and later research confirmed, that our minds are programmed not necessarily to see the world the way it is, but in ways that are useful for us to understand. Now, here's another example of a Gestalt, if you will, of seeing things not exactly the way they make sense, but we're still able to make sense of them. Have a look at this. you may want to pause the video at this time and read this. I'm going to carry on with behavioralism. With behavioralism, well, they view things very much as observable, measurable behaviors as an appropriate subject to study. I mean, they argued you can't study what you can't see, and you can't see mental processes, but you can study behavior because you can see it. It emphasized the environment as a key piece to this, and a determinant for behavior. And we're going to visit Skinner later on in this course. We'll particularly pick up on him during in the learning chapter. Now, psychoanalysis, this is a term Freud used for his personality theory and the treatment of disorders, and it was primarily focused on the unconscious parts of the brain, or our past unconscious experiences. Now, humanistic is a relatively new branch of psychology, emerged in the 60s, 1960s that is, and it focuses on the uniquenesses of human beings and their capacity for choice, growth, and psychological health. The emphasis was of a positive view of human nature, and that hadn't always been what psychology had been about. And psychology had a long time taken more of a, if you will, a medical approach at looking at what's wrong with people and how to correct things. So this was more of a positive view, and he developed what he called the hierarchy of needs. And this was Maslow's theory for motivation. Our reasons for being in terms of motivating to do things were based on our hierarchy of needs. Now, cognitive psychology, they viewed humans as active participants in the environment. One of the prominent theories of psychology were the studies of mental processes, particularly the study of thinking. Memory, problem-solving, decision-making, perception, language, and other forms of cognition is the realm of cognitive psychology. We're going to look at evolutionary and sociocultural. Now, sociocultural approach views that social and cultural factors may be just as powerful as evolutionary and physiological factors in what affects behavior and mental processes. Evolutionary psychology, on the other hand, it studies how humans have adapted the behaviors required for survival in the face of environmental pressures. When we look at biological, well, biological or physiological psychology looks for links between specific behaviors and specific biological processes. And as you recall, when we just touched on the biological earlier, we talked about you can be looking at the nervous system, you could be looking at neurons and the neurotransmitters. There's a lot of features associated with the biological, and some of it has been developed with the more advanced technologies. Along with this, in terms of advanced technologies, is neuroscience. And this combines the work of psychologists, biologists, biochemists, medical researchers, and others, and it studies the structure and function of the nervous system. Now, I'll post in week 2 folder in your Blackboard a video by Alan Jones, who did a TED Talk on the mapping of the brain, and I'll have that posted there so you can review it. All right, everybody. Here we are at the end of week 2. Please remind yourself to check your calendar, map out time for your online class. 3 hours a week, the same as any other class, is probably highly recommended. Not probably, is highly recommended. And keep at your work. Make notes in your textbook and notes separate on a piece of paper, and that'll help you when it comes to test time. All right, everybody. Good luck and carry on the good work. Bye now.